frustrated, I was beginning to doubt they ever existed. Then I discovered someone else had claimed to have found an underwater temple there. In 1994, a highly respected figure, Commander Salvatore Cicluna, who carried out marine archaeological investigations for the Royal Navy, had also reported the discovery of a prehistoric temple in 25 feet of water. Commander Cicluna has since passed away, but his friend Joseph Ellul remembers the discovery.
He told me there is a temple under the sea outside St. Julian's.
He recorded his findings in the Maltese Sunday Times, Malta's most prestigious newspaper, but they were largely ignored.
He's saying that he's found in 25 feet of water a prehistoric temple at Sliema. Joseph, what I don't understand is, this is 1994. Didn't the archaeologists in Malta follow this up?
The archaeologists in Malta are not interested.
My 50 dives hadn't located what the commander saw, but at least I'm looking. Archaeologists seem to attach no weight to tales from ancient cultures of a flood which destroyed civilization. The most famous is the Greek writer Plato's fabled story of Atlantis, the island city of the first civilized people, said to have been wiped out by a terrible flood. Plato wrote in the 4th century BC, but said that the cataclysm took place thousands of years earlier.
Excessively violent earthquakes and floods occurred, and after the onset of an unbearable day and night, the Isle of Atlantis likewise sank below the sea and disappeared.
Plato positioned Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient gateway to the Mediterranean, in other words, in the Atlantic Ocean. He says the flood had equally devastating effects within the Mediterranean, where the survivors had to begin again like children, with no memory of what went before. What's highly unusual is that Plato gives us an exact date for the flood, 9,000 years before the story reached the Greeks. That puts the submergence of Atlantis 11,500 years ago. And a remarkably similar tale from the south of India speaks of a great civilization swallowed by the sea around the very same date. Archaeologists treat Atlantis and its ancient date as a laughingstock. But now geology shows that at exactly the time Plato gives for the cataclysm, huge areas of land were indeed being submerged all around the world. The cause was one of 3 major pulses of global flooding at the end of the Ice Age. Professor John Shaw argues that the second dramatic pulse, between 11 and 12,000 years ago, could be the actual basis of Plato's story.
I would be surprised if there wasn't a connection. It seems to me that if sea level is going to rise catastrophically in a matter of days, it's going to become a major element of your history. I imagine that many of these myths are based on reality, and the reality is that sea level rose very quickly.
You look at the rate at which the sea level was rising. There are times when this rose in a peak, like around 14,000 years ago and 11,000 years ago. You see a lot of evidence of sudden outflow of water from the ice sheets. In fact, so rapid it would have created huge mountainous waves of water. I call these glacier waves avalanches that start at the top of the ice sheet. As it traveled and descended in altitude, this avalanche would have gained speed and gathered up more and more water. By the time it reaches the bottom of the ice sheet, a wave could be going several hundred miles per hour, a couple thousand feet high, and maybe even 1,000 miles in length.
It strikes me that there's a remarkable coincidence between that spike in flooding at around 11,000 or so years ago and the chronology that Plato gives us.
That particular date that Plato gave is the date that we have found was the end of the Ice Age, and it also coincided with a lot of meltwater discharge at that time.
The experts argue about how fast and violently the sea rose. But either way, I've come to realize how incomplete the archaeologists' model of the past is. Very few have taken account of the 10 million miles of lost land. It's a big haystack. But I'm going to search for the needle and follow the next lead back in Malta. Back on Malta, a group of medical doctors who've taken a keen scientific interest in prehistory and published extensively have made the radical suggestion that Malta was a part of Plato's Atlantis. An important element of their thesis on land concerns the strange grooved channels or canals, popularly known as cart ruts, which litter the Maltese islands. The function of these cart ruts has never been settled, but everyone agrees they're man-made and thousands of years old. Dr. Anton Mifsud, president of the Malta Prehistoric Society, has recently suggested that these canals are explicitly referred to in Plato's text.
They dug several kinds of canals all over the terrain. And I believe that these rock canals, the so-called cart ruts
that we're sitting
on, actually are one type of canal as described by Plato. A few people say that they were used to transport megaliths from the quarries to temples, and there is also the hypothesis that they were served to transport agricultural produce from the fields up to right up to the habitations, and that's what in fact Plato attributes to the function of the same ruts, of the same canals.
Right.
Going over the physical features as described by Plato, I could see that they built a lot of temples to their gods. But there's nowhere else in the world in which such megalithic temples are present in such a concentration.
One of Mifsud's co-authors told me of similar cart ruts which have been found underwater off Malta's northwest coast, another possible clue to the missing underworld.
So Chris, we're going to dive first at the two sites on the west, the northwest side, the canals and the steps. Yes, yes.
We set off on a local fishing boat converted for diving. Submerged cart ruts or canals have been seen by a number of divers over the years in various locations around Malta. Geologists tell us that this part of the island is slowly rising. The submerged ruts we're going to see would have last stood above water more than 11,000 years ago.
Okay, got it?
The underwater ruts are heavily overgrown with seagrass, but their appearance is unmistakable. Deeply incised into a plateau of hard limestone bedrock, they're the same phenomenon exactly as the mysterious prehistoric cart ruts that are found above water.